May 8th, 1942, Flag Bridge, IJN Zuikaku, Coral Sea. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi lowered his binoculars with hands that trembled despite more than 3 decades of naval command. He had fought on cruisers during the Siberian Intervention, commanded destroyers during the Shanghai Incident, and spent years studying battle plans, fleet compositions, and wargame simulations at Eta Jima Naval Academy and the Naval Staff College. He believed he understood war at sea, not by theory alone, but by experience. Yet, what he had just witnessed through the swirling chaos of smoke, salt spray, and flickering flame defied every principle he had been taught. It defied reason, it defied history, and most dangerously, it defied belief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The American carrier Lexington, designated Target Alpha, had not merely been struck, it had been annihilated. 2 Type 91 aerial torpedoes had struck her port side at 0940 hours, close enough that Takagi could practically feel the concussive tremor shudder through his own ship. Then came 7 more torpedoes, launched in meticulously coordinated waves, each Japanese aviator trained to strike from the optimal depth and angle for maximum hull penetration. The final 2 hit near her forward aviation fuel storage. 11 torpedoes, 11 direct hits. The kind of damage that textbooks would have described not as critical, not as catastrophic, but as absolute. Then came the bomb hits, high explosive and armor-piercing, hundreds of kilograms each, slamming into steel, wood, aviation gasoline lines, aircraft storage and ammunition lifts, igniting infernos that sent great geysers of flame, twisting and curling like hellfire pillars into the morning sky. By every calculation, every doctrine, every lesson drilled into officers for the last half-century, Lexington should already have been beneath the water. She should have slipped below the waves like a stricken leviathan, leaving only a smear of oil, a few twisted lifeboats, and a ghostly haze on the horizon. Yet, she was still afloat. More than afloat. She was fighting. Her flight deck, scorched, battered, and riddled with craters, was launching fighters and dive bombers, even as smoke still rose from her wounds. Takagi lowered his binoculars again, then raised them a 3rd time, as though the very act of observation might reveal a trick of light, a mirage his mind had conjured, because reality was simply too absurd. But the sight that met his eyes was unmistakable. The long wooden deck, blackened but not burning. The rising plumes of smoke trailing from her funnels, her dauntless bombers rising into the sky with eerie calm, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. His operations officer stood silently beside him, eyes fixed on the same impossible sight. "She should not be moving, sir," he whispered, his voice hollow. She should not be alive. In the cold calculus of naval warfare, there were thresholds, mathematical certainties. 6 torpedoes could sink a cruiser, 4 could doom a battleship, depending on placement. For a carrier, 5 hits would leave it crippled, 6 would leave it dead, 11 was unthinkable, 11 was myth. And yet, what Takagi had discovered that morning, in the crucible of Coral Sea, was that American carriers were not built merely to float. They were built to endure. He recalled the observations of the naval attaché in Washington before the war, reports Tokyo had dismissed as exaggerations. The Americans built their carriers not just large, he had written, but resilient. Everything redundant, everything reinforced. Fire suppression systems multiplied, rerouted, compartmentalized. Not 2 water mains, but 4. Not 1 electrical grid, but 5. Their carriers did not merely survive damage. They were designed to continue operating while damaged. That was heresy to Japanese doctrine. At Eta Jima, cadets had been taught that the purpose of protection was to delay destruction, not to allow combat continuation. Ships fought at full strength or not at all. Damage control existed to buy time for evacuation or scuttling, not to revive combat capability. That was the Japanese way. But the Americans had rewritten the way. A sudden flicker on the horizon. More aircraft rising from the Lexington. Takagi felt something he had not felt in many years, perhaps not since he was a young officer during his first fleet exercise when a torpedo drill had gone unpredictably wrong. It was not fear, it was not panic, it was something more unsettling than either. It was doubt. Below, the chart room hummed with activity. Officers muttered over fleet dispositions, intelligence reports, weather charts. But every few seconds, one or two would drift to the portside windows, gazing across the sea like men staring at an apparition that should not exist. The helmsman, usually stoic, whispered to no one in particular, "How does a ship live through that?" It was a question without an answer, because the answer was too large to grasp. It was not merely steel, not merely engineering. It was philosophy. It was doctrine. It was a nation's belief that machines should protect men, that lives should be preserved, not spent. Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Shokaku, Zuikaku, were warriors themselves, swift and lethal, designed to strike first, strike hard, strike decisively. They were attack platforms, floating swords. Their strength was in destruction. American carriers, Yorktown, Lexington, Enterprise, Saratoga, were different. They were fortresses, floating cities, industrial creations, designed not just for combat, but for endurance, for recovery, for survival. They embodied not the spirit of the samurai, but the spirit of the assembly line. Interchangeable, repairable, adaptable. A damaged Japanese carrier ceased to exist as a weapon. A damaged American carrier simply became a different kind of weapon. He watched Lexington again. A great plume of smoke still trailed from her port quarter, staining the sky in streaks of grey and black. She looked wounded, mutilated even, but she looked alive. Takagi realized, with growing unease, that this was no accident. This was design. The Americans had built ships that assumed they would be hit, not just once, not just twice, but repeatedly, and they engineered them to fight while being hit. It was a concept utterly alien to the Japanese naval mindset. In the Japanese Navy, to be struck was to fail, to be damaged was to have erred, to sink was honorable, but to struggle to survive was shameful. But here, on this morning, 1,900 miles from Tokyo, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi understood a brutal truth. The Americans did not believe in sinking. They believed in fighting. Below decks on the Lexington, damage control parties waded through waist-deep water, patching ruptured bulkheads, isolating flooded compartments, rerouting fire mains. Sailors formed bucket brigades when pipes failed. Men who had never met worked shoulder to shoulder in suffocating smoke to keep fuel from igniting, to keep flames from spreading, to keep steel from melting. The ship was not merely a structure, it was a living thing, sustained by the will of those inside her. A damage control officer, Chief Warrant Officer Harold Bishop, shouted orders through a cracked mouthpiece. His voice was shredded from smoke inhalation, but he refused to leave his post. He had been a machinist for 19 years before the war. He understood steel, he understood pressure, he understood survival. "Keep pumping!" he roared as men struggled to contain flooding in engine room number 2. "She'll float, if we make her float." Above him, on the flight deck, aircraft still took off, and across the ocean, officers aboard Zuikaku watched in silent awe. Takagi eventually spoke, though his voice felt brittle. "What we are witnessing is not a ship." He paused. His officers waited. He swallowed. "It is a message." Commander Komura, his flag captain, frowned. "From whom, sir?" "From a country," Takagi replied, lowering his binoculars slowly. "That builds for the next battle, even while still fighting the first." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a tone that barely carried over the wind, Takagi said words he would never repeat in any official report and which would never be recorded in any logbook. "We have underestimated them." He did not mean their weapons. He did not mean their pilots. He did not even mean their ships. He meant their will. From that day forward, the Japanese knew that American carriers could not merely be destroyed. They had to be overwhelmed. They had to be drowned in fire, crushed under explosive force, shattered beyond the power of steel and men to resist. They could not merely be struck. They had to be killed, because if they were not killed, they would come back, and if they came back, they would win. Years later, long after the war, Takagi would reportedly write in an unpublished memoir, "In traditional Japanese strategy, ships were warriors. In American strategy, ships were cities. Our ships struck harder. Theirs lived longer. In the end, it was the living that defeated the striking." And in that final reflection lay the truth of Coral Sea. Not merely the first carrier battle in history, but the first true test of industrial endurance versus doctrinal precision, of philosophy versus engineering, of survival versus sacrifice. On May 8, 1942, a ship that should have died lived, and history learned that surviving was a form of victory. "This is impossible," Commander Takahashi Kaku, Zuikaku's air officer, whispered. "Shoho took 3 torpedoes and capsized in minutes. We hit this American monster with 11 and she's still fighting." What Takagi and his staff were witnessing was more than just superior American damage control. It was the collision between 2 completely different philosophies of warship construction, 2 opposing theories of naval survival, and 2 irreconcilable approaches to carrier warfare. And in that moment, as Lexington's anti-aircraft batteries continued firing despite catastrophic damage, Japanese naval doctrine began to crack. The horror spreading through the Japanese carrier fleet wasn't just about one ship's resilience, it was about what that resilience revealed. If American carriers could absorb punishment that would destroy Japanese carriers instantly, then every assumption underlying Imperial Navy strategy was wrong. The entire Pacific War had been predicated on achieving decisive victories through aggressive action. But what happened when aggressive action couldn't sink the enemy? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 3 hours earlier, at 06:15, Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi had led 70 aircraft from Zuikaku and Shokaku toward the American carriers. A veteran of Pearl Harbor, China, and the Indian Ocean, Takahashi had never failed to sink his target. His pre-strike briefing to the assembled pilots had been confident. American carriers are weakly built. They prioritize speed and aircraft capacity over armor. Strike hard at the waterline. 3 torpedoes will break their backs. 4 will send them to the bottom. This assessment was based on solid intelligence and Japanese naval architectural theory. Commander Minoru Genda, architect of carrier doctrine, had written extensively about American carrier vulnerabilities. The Americans build their carriers like merchant ships with flight decks. They have no armor belt worthy of the name. Their subdivision is inadequate. They are floating bombs waiting for a spark. The Japanese approach to carrier construction emphasized offensive striking power above all else. Carriers like Zuikaku, displaced 25,675 tons standard, could make 34 knots and carried 72 aircraft. But to achieve this performance, Japanese designers had made calculated sacrifices. Armor protection was minimal. The fight deck was wood over a thin steel structure. Fuel systems used minimum subdivision to maximize capacity. Damage control parties were small, with limited equipment. This design philosophy reflected Bushido applied to naval architecture. The carrier's purpose was to strike first and strike decisively. If the enemy struck back, the carrier had already failed its mission. Therefore, defensive capabilities were secondary to offensive power. Captain Tamon Yamaguchi, one of the Navy's most aggressive commanders, had encapsulated this thinking. A carrier that needs heavy armor has already lost the battle. Our carriers must be swift, deadly, and fearless. If we do our job correctly, we will sink the enemy before they can strike us. When the war began, this philosophy appeared vindicated. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers had operated with impunity. In the Indian Ocean in April 1942, 5 carriers had devastated British forces, sinking the carrier Hermes, heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, and dozens of merchant ships without sustaining damage. The Kido Butai, the carrier striking force, seemed invincible. Then came Coral Sea, and everything changed. The battle began on May 7th, 1942, with both sides searching desperately for each other's carriers. At 10:40 hours, Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi's strike group from Zuikaku and Shokaku found not the American fleet carriers, but the light carrier Shoho, designated by the Americans, escorting the invasion force bound for Port Moresby. What happened next would become the template for Japanese horror in this battle. At 11:35, 93 American aircraft from Lexington and Yorktown swarmed Shoho. The attack was devastatingly coordinated. Dive bombers struck first, wrecking the flight deck and starting fires. Then, torpedo bombers attacked from both sides simultaneously, the dreaded hammer and anvil tactic that gave defenders no good option. Captain Izawa, commanding Shoho, fought his ship brilliantly. His damage control parties responded instantly to the first bomb hits. The crew maintained discipline despite the chaos. But Japanese carrier construction left no margin for error. The first torpedo struck at 11:36, flooding 2 boiler rooms and killing engine room personnel. Shoho's speed dropped from 28 to 18 knots. The second torpedo hit 3 minutes later, opening the hull to the sea and causing a 7-degree list. Damage control teams raced to counter flooding, but the ship's limited subdivision meant water spread rapidly through connected compartments. The third torpedo, striking at 11:41, was catastrophic. It detonated directly beneath the island's superstructure, rupturing fuel lines and starting uncontrollable fires. Aviation gasoline, stored with minimal protection for weight savings, ignited. Within 8 minutes, Shoho was dead in the water, listing 20 degrees, her flight deck a sheet of flame. Commander Takatsugu Jojima, executive officer, made the final entry in the ship's log at 11:50. Unable to control flooding or fires, recommend abandon ship, long live the Emperor. At 11:55, Shoho rolled over and sank, taking Captain Izawa and over 631 crew with her from first torpedo hit to capsizing, 19 minutes, total torpedo hits 3. When reports of Shoho's loss reached Admiral Takagi on Zuikaku, the reaction was shock, but not horror. Shoho was a light carrier, converted from a submarine tender with minimal protection. Her loss was regrettable but understandable. She had been overwhelmed by numbers. The American pilots had gotten lucky. These things happened in war. But Admiral Takagi was a thoughtful officer. He ordered his staff to compile a detailed analysis of Shoho's loss. Commander Yahachi Tanabe, the staff damage control officer, produced a report that should have alarmed everyone who read it. Shoho's loss reveals fundamental vulnerabilities in our carrier design. The rapid flooding indicates inadequate watertight subdivision. The uncontrollable fires suggest insufficient fire suppression capability. The speed of capsizing shows our ships have minimal stability margin. Recommendation: examine American carrier construction for comparison. The report was filed and forgotten. There were battles to fight, and dwelling on structural vulnerabilities seemed defeatist. Besides, Zuikaku and Shokaku were fleet carriers, far more robust than converted Shoho. They would certainly prove more resilient. This assumption would be tested the very next morning. USS Lexington, commissioned in December 1927, was one of the great paradoxes of naval architecture. Originally designed as a battle cruiser under the Washington Naval Treaty, she was converted to a carrier but retained many characteristics of her original purpose. She displaced 37,681 tons standard, far heavier than any Japanese carrier. Her belt armor was 5 to 7 inches thick in critical areas. Her torpedo defense system was revolutionary, consisting of multiple void spaces and longitudinal bulkheads designed to contain and dissipate torpedo explosions. But what truly set Lexington apart was her damage control capability. The US Navy had studied the Battle of Jutland in 1916 intensively, learning harsh lessons about magazine protection, fire control, and damage containment. American carriers incorporated these lessons. Each carrier had large, well-trained damage control parties. Portable pumps, emergency generators, firefighting equipment, and repair materials were distributed throughout the ship. Fuel systems were designed with redundancy and isolation. Most importantly, American carriers had what Japanese ships lacked: a damage control philosophy. Commander Herbert "Pop" Healy, Lexington's damage control officer, ran his department like a fire department in a city made of explosives. Every sailor knew multiple damage control stations. Drills were constant and realistic. Equipment was inspected daily. Healy had instituted a simple rule: assume the worst will happen and prepare for worse than that. This preparation was about to be tested beyond anything Healy had imagined. At 0940 on May 8th, Japanese torpedo bombers approached Lexington in a coordinated attack. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, leading the strike, was a master of the hammer and anvil tactic. He split his force, sending torpedo bombers to both sides of Lexington simultaneously. This gave the American ship an impossible choice: turn into one group of torpedoes and turn broadside to the other. Captain Frederick Sherman, commanding Lexington, did what he could. He ordered emergency turns, trying to comb the torpedo wakes, presenting the narrowest possible target. His anti-aircraft batteries filled the sky with fire, but against 69 Japanese aircraft attacking simultaneously, miracles of seamanship couldn't prevent disaster. The first torpedo struck Lexington's port side at 0941. The 720-pound Type 91 warhead exploded against the torpedo defense system, exactly as designed. The outer hull ruptured. The void space absorbed the explosion. The inner bulkhead held. Lexington shuddered, but maintained course and speed. On Zuikaku's flag bridge, Admiral Takagi watched through binoculars. "Good hit," he said. "She'll slow now." Lexington didn't slow. Captain Sherman kept her at 25 knots, maintaining maneuverability. The second torpedo hit 30 seconds later, same side 20 feet after the first hit. Again, the torpedo defense system functioned. Again, Lexington shuddered and kept moving. Below decks, Commander Healy was orchestrating a desperate ballet of damage control. "All stations, this is DC Central. Torpedo hits port side, frames 90 and 110, flooding in voids 3 Alpha and 4 Alpha. Counter-flooding starboard voids 5 and 6 to maintain trim. Engineering, maintain pressure on fire mains. Medical, prepare for casualties." The third, fourth, and fifth torpedoes struck in rapid succession, all on the port side, concentrating damage in a 100-foot section of hull. This should have been catastrophic. Concentrated torpedo hits sink ships by opening a large section of hull to the sea, causing progressive flooding that overwhelms pumps and countermeasures. But Lexington's designers had anticipated exactly this scenario. Each void space was isolated. Each watertight door was closed and dogged. Each bulkhead was designed to withstand the water pressure that would result if adjacent spaces flooded. As water rushed into the damaged sections, it encountered barrier after barrier, slowing its spread, containing its destruction. Commander Tanabe on Zuikaku, watching the American carrier absorb hit after hit, began to feel something he had never experienced in combat: dread. 5 torpedoes, he said to no one in particular. 5 torpedoes and she's still making 20 knots. How is this possible? The 6th and 7th torpedoes struck almost simultaneously at 0953. One hit near the bow, the other amidships. The bow hit was particularly dangerous, threatening to flood forward magazines and break the ship's back. But Lexington's longitudinal strength, legacy of her battlecruiser origins, held. The structure flexed, but didn't fracture. The magazines remained dry. The 8th, 9th, and 10th torpedoes followed over the next 6 minutes. Each struck home, each exploded, each sent thousands of gallons of seawater flooding into Lexington's hull. The cumulative damage was staggering. 20 feet of hull plating were blown inward, 6 void spaces were flooded. The port list reached 7 degrees despite continuous counter-flooding, yet Lexington fought on. Her flight deck remained operational, her catapults functioned, her aircraft continued launching and recovering. At 10:20, the 11th and final torpedo struck Lexington's port side near the stern. This hit damaged the steering gear, causing temporary loss of control. For 3 minutes, Lexington circled helplessly. A perfect target. Japanese pilots, running low on fuel and ammunition, pressed their attacks with bomb runs and strafing. But at 10:23, auxiliary steering was rigged, and Lexington steadied on course. The Japanese strike force withdrew at 10:30, their ammunition exhausted, their fuel gauges reading minimum. Behind them, Lexington was burning and listing but still underway, still fighting, still operational. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, leading the strike group home, radioed Admiral Takagi. Lexington hit with 11 torpedoes, multiple bombs, heavy damage observed. Fires burning, assessment, critically damaged, will likely sink within hours, returning to carrier. On Zuikaku, Admiral Takagi processed this information with growing unease. 11 torpedoes. Shoho had sunk with 3. Even accounting for Lexington's larger size, the disparity was impossible to ignore. What did the Americans know about building carriers that the Imperial Navy didn't? The answer lay in fundamental design philosophy. Japanese carriers were built on the principle that offense was the best defense. Every ton devoted to armor, every cubic meter used for void spaces, every sailor assigned to damage control was a ton, a space, a man not contributing to striking power. This made sense if battles were decided by the first strike. But what happened when both sides struck simultaneously? Commander Masataka Okumiya, an experienced carrier officer, later wrote about this moment. "We designed our carriers to win quickly or not at all. The Americans designed theirs to win eventually. When the war became a grinding contest of attrition, our philosophy proved fatal. At Coral Sea, we learned that American carriers could absorb punishment that would destroy our ships instantly. This should have revolutionized our approach. Instead, we continued building carriers the same way, telling ourselves that spirit and skill would overcome structural disadvantage." Yorktown, Lexington's sister ship in task force, had absorbed her own punishment during the Japanese strike. She took one bomb hit that penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the interior, killing 66 men and starting serious fires. But, like Lexington, the Yorktown's damage control parties responded instantly. By 10:45, barely an hour after being hit, Yorktown had her fires under control and was recovering aircraft. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had trained his crew relentlessly in damage control. When the bomb hit, every man knew exactly what to do. Repair parties sealed ruptured compartments. Fire teams extinguished burning aviation gasoline using fog nozzles and chemical foam. Medical personnel treated wounded without overwhelming the medical spaces. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was operating at near normal efficiency. The contrast with Shokaku was instructive. The Japanese carrier had absorbed 3 bomb hits during the American strike. Each started fires. Japanese damage control parties fought valiantly, but they lacked the equipment and training of their American counterparts. Water pressure in the fire mains was inadequate. Portable pumps were in short supply. Most critically, the crew had never trained for damage control with the intensity Americans had. Firefighting was considered a secondary skill for warriors whose primary job was operating aircraft and weapons. The result was that Shokaku's fires burned longer and did more damage than comparable hits on American carriers. By 1100 hours on May 8th, Shokaku was withdrawing from the battle, her flight deck too damaged to operate aircraft, her fires still burning despite hours of firefighting. She would require months of repair. Yet, she had sustained only 3 bomb hits to Lexington's 11 torpedoes and multiple bombs. What Admiral Takagi couldn't know, as he ordered Shokaku to retreat, was that Lexington's survival would prove temporary. Not because of the 11 torpedoes she had survived, but because of what those torpedoes had set in motion inside her hull. At 12:47, More than 3 hours after the last torpedo hit, Lexington was still making 25 knots, preparing to recover her aircraft. Commander Healy's damage control parties had contained the flooding, controlled the fires, and restored most systems. The ship seemed to have survived the unsurvivable. Then, deep in Lexington's hull, aviation, gasoline vapor that had been leaking from ruptured fuel lines since the torpedo hits found an ignition source. The explosion was catastrophic. It blew apart interior bulkheads that the torpedoes hadn't breached, started fires in spaces that had remained dry, and created a chain reaction that no amount of damage control could contain. Captain Sherman ordered abandon ship at 5:30 p.m. Lexington sank at 8 p.m. and torpedoed by the American destroyer Phelps to prevent capture. Of her crew of 2,651, 2,170 were rescued. The loss was tragic, but what the Japanese didn't realize was that Lexington had won the strategic victory, even in sinking. She had remained operational for 8 hours after absorbing 11 torpedoes. She had recovered her aircraft. She had maintained formation speed. She had forced the Japanese to commit resources to attacking a target that refused to die. Most importantly, she had revealed that American carriers could survive punishment that would obliterate Japanese carriers. When news of Lexington's eventual sinking reached Admiral Takagi, he should have felt relief. Instead, he felt horror. 11 torpedoes in 8 hours, he told his staff. Shoho took 3 torpedoes in 19 minutes. Do you understand what this means? It means that in any exchange of strikes, we will lose more carriers than the Americans. It means that attrition favors them. It means that we cannot win a long war. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended in tactical draw, but strategic American victory. Both sides lost 1 carrier, Shoho for Japan, Lexington for America. Both sides had another carrier damaged, Zuikaku for Japan, Yorktown for America. But the psychological impact was entirely one-sided. The Japanese had proven they could damage American carriers. The Americans had proven they could survive damage that would sink Japanese carriers instantly. Commander Okumiya later wrote extensively about the lessons Japanese naval command should have learned from Coral Sea. The Americans showed us that carrier battles would be decided not just by striking power, but by survivability. Their carriers were more heavily built, more thoroughly protected, and far better equipped for damage control. We should have immediately begun redesigning our carriers. We should have sacrificed some aircraft capacity for better protection. We should have quintupled our damage control training and equipment. Instead, we told ourselves that Lexington eventually sank. Therefore, our doctrine was correct. This delusion cost us the war. The disparity in carrier survivability would manifest repeatedly throughout the Pacific War. At Midway, 1 month after Coral Sea, Yorktown would absorb 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedoes over 2 days before finally sinking. Meanwhile, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu would all succumb to just 3 to 5 bomb hits each, their unprotected aviation fuel systems turning them into floating infernos. Hiryu would survive longest of the Japanese carriers at Midway, but even she would sink from just 4 bomb hits. The pattern was unmistakable. American carriers could survive multiple fatal hits, while Japanese carriers could not. The structural reasons were clear to anyone who studied both designs. American carriers had armored hangar decks in critical areas, armored magazines, sophisticated torpedo defense systems with multiple void spaces, extensive fire suppression systems, including sprinklers and foam generators, redundant fuel systems with isolation valves, large damage control parties with extensive equipment, and design philosophy, emphasizing survivability as much as striking power. Japanese carriers, by contrast, had wooden flight decks over thin steel, minimal armor except on magazines, simple torpedo defense with limited void spaces, basic fire suppression, relying primarily on water hoses, fuel systems designed for capacity rather than safety, small damage control parties with limited equipment, and design philosophy prioritizing offense over defense. The fuel system difference was particularly critical. American carriers used aviation gasoline storage with nitrogen inerting systems, double-hulled fuel tanks, remote-operated isolation valves, extensive ventilation to prevent vapor accumulation, and fuel lines designed to minimize leak potential. Japanese carriers had single-hulled fuel tanks, manual isolation valves requiring crew access, minimal ventilation, and fuel lines running through crew spaces. When hit, American carriers might leak fuel, but they had systems to prevent vapor accumulation and ignition. When hit, Japanese carriers became bombs waiting to explode. Captain Toshio Abe, who served on multiple Japanese carriers, wrote after the war about the terror of serving on ships he knew were floating death traps. Every torpedo that approached, every bomb that fell, we knew one hit might be our last. American sailors fought with confidence that their ships could survive damage. We fought, knowing ours could not. This psychological burden was perhaps as damaging as the structural vulnerability. The lesson of 11 torpedoes versus 3 was lost on Japanese Naval Command because acknowledging it would require admitting fundamental design failures. Instead, official reports from Coral Sea emphasized Lexington's eventual sinking while minimizing Shoho's rapid, almost effortless destruction. The narrative crafted in Tokyo became elegantly simple, disastrously convenient. Both sides had lost one carrier, and therefore the battle was tactically and symbolically even. That interpretation was not merely wrong, it was comfortable. It justified doctrine, it preserved pride, and it protected the illusion that the Imperial Navy still held the advantage. The truth, however, sat like a silent, corrosive acid in the minds of those who had actually watched the battle unfold. Men like Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi. They had seen the scale of destruction inflicted on Lexington. They had watched the smoke-belching American carrier, still launching aircraft, after absorbing damage that would have left any Japanese carrier broken, burning, and dying. They had watched a ship refuse to die, and although Lexington eventually did succumb, not to enemy ordnance, but to uncontrollable fires hours later, her death was nothing like Shoho's. Shoho had died in minutes. Lexington had died in defiance. To Admiral Takagi, the difference between the two ships was not just a question of design, but of philosophy. In his private journal, recovered after the war, he wrote on May 9, 1942, "We cannot trade carriers with the Americans on even terms. They can build faster than we can. Their carriers survive better than ours. Their damage control is superior. Their industrial capacity is overwhelming. Today, we won a tactical victory, but revealed a strategic nightmare. Unless we can achieve decisive victory quickly, time favors the enemy absolutely. The 11 torpedoes it took to sink Lexington will haunt me forever." In Tokyo, however, it would not haunt anyone, because no one wished to remember. The Imperial General Headquarters, steeped in rigid hierarchical thought and immovable doctrine, had long believed that Japan's advantage lay in skill, spirit, and precision. America's advantage lay in numbers, ignorance, and brute force manufacturing. At Coral Sea, skill had indeed been present on both sides. Spirit had been strong in both fleets. But something else had emerged. Something Japan had never accounted for. Adaptability. American ships could take damage and still fight. Their crews could improvise, rewire systems, create new pathways where old ones had failed. They did not fight to maintain perfect order. They fought to survive chaos. Japanese naval doctrine revolved around discipline, pre-planned responses, and technical precision. In contrast, American doctrine evolved into something almost frighteningly flexible. It made room for error, improvisation, and above all, endurance. The Japanese concept of damage control was largely about containment, isolating fire, sealing flooded compartments, buying time before the inevitable order to abandon ship. The American concept of damage control was something else entirely: restoration. It sought to not merely slow destruction, but to reverse it. That difference alone changed the future of the Pacific. In Tokyo, The Coral Sea battle was summarized into a single elegant equation. One carrier lost for one carrier lost is parity. It was an equation that ignored critical variables: carrier size, durability, operational endurance, and, most importantly, replaceability. American industrial capacity could produce a new fully operational fleet carrier in roughly 2 years and a light escort carrier in as little as 8 months. Japanese shipyards, limited by resource shortages, labor inefficiencies, and doctrine that favored perfection over production, often required 3 to 5 years to produce a fleet carrier. And there were only a few facilities in the entire empire capable of such construction. Japan could build beauty and lethality, sleek, swift carriers like Shokaku and Zuikaku, elegant engineering marvels, built to strike and built to kill. But America could build resilience. Ships like Lexington, Yorktown, and later Essex, built to take punishment, built to endure, and critically, built to be replaced faster than they could be sunk. This fundamental imbalance was concealed behind numbers. Japan believed they could sink faster than America could launch. That was true briefly in the first 6 months of the war. But after Coral Sea, after Midway, after Guadalcanal, and certainly after 1943, it became clear that America's shipyards were not just facilities. They were factories of inevitability. While Japanese naval staff published statements of careful optimism, projecting confidence, Takagi wrote privately about his deepening fear. In his journal, after reviewing damage reports from the battle, he wrote, "Our ships are sharp but brittle. Theirs are blunt but unbreakable. Sharpness is an advantage only under perfect conditions. Bluntness survives imperfection." This was not an observation of design alone. It was a metaphor for the war itself. It was not that Japanese engineers were ignorant of survivability. They understood armor, compartmentalization, fireproofing, and damage control. But Japanese naval philosophy did not celebrate resilience. It celebrated perfection. It worshipped precision. Ships were designed to avoid being struck, not to withstand being struck. To be hit was to fail. At Eta Jima, cadets learned that superior skill prevented damage. They believed that battles would be won decisively, quickly, and with minimal hits exchanged. A ship's role was to strike, not to absorb. America did not see it that way. From the very beginning, they assumed that ships would be hit. They assumed that fires would break out, that hulls would flood, that fuel lines would ignite. Their ship designs reflected that assumption, not as a weakness, but as a principle. They built redundancy, not just into the steel, but into the culture. Damage control was not merely a duty, it was a doctrine. In the Imperial Navy, damage control was the work of engineers. In the United States Navy, damage control was the work of everyone. It is no coincidence that during the war, American damage control schools trained tens of thousands of men every year, while Japan trained only a few hundred. On American ships, any sailor, from cook to clerk to radio operator, could be called to fight fire, repair breaches, or pump flooding water. On Japanese ships, those tasks were restricted to specialists, and specialists could be killed. Equally important was what Takagi called the tyranny of replacement. In one letter after the war, he wrote, "In Japan, we replaced ships with regrets. In America, they replaced ships with blueprints." It was true. When carriers like Shokaku or Akagi were damaged, they required shipyard-level repairs that took months. Worse, they required facilities that existed in only a handful of locations across Asia and the Japanese home islands. In contrast, Yorktown, after being badly damaged at Coral Sea, sailed to Pearl Harbor, underwent emergency repairs, and was back in combat 22 days later at Midway. Still limping, still riddled with damage, but fighting. It was a story Japan could not believe, literally. Takagi recorded in his journal on June 6, 1942. "Our intelligence reported that Yorktown was at Midway. High Command said it was impossible. They said we sank her at Coral Sea. They believed their conclusion more than their eyes." That failure to believe would cost Japan the Battle of Midway, and, indirectly, the entire war. The Imperial Navy believed in decisive battle. Their entire doctrine, the Kantai Kessen, was built on the belief that one mighty, carefully orchestrated, perfectly executed battle would determine the war. Japan would strike a crippling blow against America's Pacific Fleet, and the enemy, shocked by the ferocity and precision of the attack, would sue for peace. The concept had its strengths. It had historical precedent. It was elegant, but it required one thing that war almost never grants: control. American doctrine, emerging slowly, painfully, and through necessity rather than design, did not depend on control. It depended on momentum. Japan believed in winning battles. America believed in winning wars. Japan believed in the elimination of enemy capability. America believed in the regeneration of its own. Japan believed ships were weapons. America believed ships were tools. A weapon is singular. It acts once. It is used and then spent. A tool is repeatable. It endures. At Coral Sea, America lost a weapon, but preserved a tool. They lost a ship, but preserved a method, a mindset, and a model. Japan, however, mistook Lexington's death for proof that they had won the exchange. In truth, they had lost something far more important. They had lost the illusion of invincibility. In 1942, Japan could still believe, if it wished, that it held superiority in training, discipline, and fleet composition. But after Coral Sea, and certainly after Midway, something began to shift, like tectonic plates beneath polite conversation at naval headquarters. Officers began to whisper about damage control failures. Younger commanders began to ask why Japanese crews were trained less in fire containment. Some quietly questioned the wisdom of using carriers with external fuel lines rather than steel-protected ones. None of these questions reached official doctrine before it was too late. It was not simply that Japan lacked steel, oil, and aluminum. She lacked time. Time to adapt. Time to redesign. Time to relearn. America had an advantage Japan could not replicate. She could afford to learn through mistakes. Japan could not. Every mistake was devastating, because every ship mattered. America lost ships and adapted. Japan lost ships and suffered. As Takagi observed, they lose and learn, we lose and vanish. The official Japanese Naval General Staff post-battle summary of Coral Sea concluded with this line: "The enemy, although tactically skilled, lacks the disciplined precision of imperial aviators." It was a tidy statement. It was comforting. It was fatal. Japanese aviators were precise, unquestionably skilled, masterfully trained. But precision demanded perfection. And in a war where chaos has ruled the seas, perfection had no place. America's carrier war was won not by perfection, but by survival. The lesson of 11 torpedoes versus 3 was never simply about torpedoes. It was about two nations and what they believed ships were meant to do. Japan built ships to fight flawlessly. America built ships to fight again. In the end, it was not perfection that won the Pacific. It was endurance. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.